The ransom note was written in crayon, not because whoever sent it was being cruel, though they were, but because they had used what was available. A red crayon, thick strokes, block letters on the back of a grocery receipt. It said, "We have the girl. Tell Shin to stand down, or she comes back in pieces." It had been slipped under the front door of their Baltimore apartment sometime between 6:47 a.m., when Jae-won left for work, and 7:15 a.m., when Adiz opened the door to retrieve the morning paper. She found it pressed against the welcome mat, red letters facing up, the word pieces catching the morning light like a wound. For 3 full seconds, Adiz did not move. She stood in her scrubs, her coffee mug in her right hand, and her brain did what trained nurses' brains do under shock. It cataloged. Red crayon, grocery receipt, block letters. Then her mind went somewhere else entirely, somewhere ancient and animal, and she turned and ran to Naya's bedroom. The bed was empty. The stuffed elephant, Dr. Peanuts, sat alone against the pillow with his button eyes aimed at the ceiling, and that small, ridiculous, heartbreaking detail was what finally broke the breath out of Adiz's chest in a sound she had never made before in her life. Naya was 8 years old. She had been gone for less than 30 minutes. Jae-won was on the highway when his phone rang. He answered on the first ring because the number was Adiz, and Adiz never called before 8 a.m. unless something was wrong. She said 4 words before the sound overtook her voice entirely. 4 words that Jae-won heard so clearly that they seemed to rearrange something permanent inside him. "They took our daughter." The highway blurred. Do-hyun, who was driving, heard the shift in the quality of the car's silence and checked the mirror once. Jae-won's face had gone the color of old concrete. Not pale, not flushed, simply absent of everything that wasn't calculation. He told Adiz to lock the door, touch nothing, and wait. His voice was very quiet, the quietest it had ever been. Do-hyun was already taking the exit back toward the city before Jae-won said a word to him. They both understood that the world had just changed shape again, faster and harder than either of them had expected. Jae-won had been clean for 5 months and 11 days. 5 months of logistics meetings and spreadsheets and school drop-offs and jollof rice attempts and ordinary Tuesday evenings that felt like gifts. 5 months of being the man Adiz had waited for. The man Naya was beginning to know as simply her father, steady, present, real. 5 months of carrying nothing heavier than the guilt of the past, which was heavy enough. He had believed, or tried to believe, that the exit was clean, that the men who had sanctioned it had meant it, that the particular kind of danger that came with his name had been quietly transferred to someone else's ledger. He had been wrong. Not about the exit. The exit was real, the release was genuine. He had been wrong about something older and darker. The fact that some enemies do not care about your new life. Some enemies have been watching and waiting and counting the months since you put down your armor, and they chose their moment precisely because they knew you'd set it down. The note had been placed by someone who knew his schedule. That was the detail that hit hardest. Not the threat, not even the crayon, the schedule. Whoever had done this knew that Jae-won left at 6:47. Knew that Adiz checked the door at 7:15. Knew that the window between those 2 times was exactly the window in which Naya would be moved from her bed. Through the window, the crime scene team would later confirm, the one facing the alley, the one Jae-won had always meant to put a secondary lock on and hadn't, because 5 months of ordinary life makes you believe in ordinary safety. He sat in the back of the car as Do-hyun drove, and he let himself feel the guilt for exactly 45 seconds. He timed it internally, the way a man times the moment before he dives into cold water. 45 seconds of knowing he had done this, that his history had found his daughter, that the most protected person in his world had been taken because of who he used to be. Then he put the guilt away. There was no room for it. There was only Naya. And whoever had Naya had just made the last mistake of their lives. The crime scene told a story that no one in Adiz's world wanted to read. 2 federal agents arrived within an hour. Caswell had made a call when Jae-won reached him. a quiet, urgent call that pulled resources faster than normal channels would have allowed. They moved through the apartment with practiced efficiency, bagging the grocery receipt, photographing the window, measuring the distance from the alley to the fire escape with a tool that clicked softly in the morning quiet. Adiz sat on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders that she didn't remember anyone putting there, watching them work. Rin was beside her. She had called Rin before she called anyone else. And Rin had arrived in 11 minutes still wearing her hospital lanyard, had taken one look at Adiz's face, and simply sat down beside her and did not leave. The apartment smelled like the coffee that had gone cold on the counter, and somewhere outside a garbage truck was making its rounds, and the complete, obscene ordinariness of those sounds against the terror inside the walls felt like a second wound. The window confirmed what the note had implied. This was planned. The secondary frame had been compromised days earlier, the locking mechanism filed down on the outside, so that a firm push from the alley would swing it open without resistance. Whoever had done this had been inside the alley before last night, possibly multiple times. The agent who found this, a young woman named Pratt, with close-cropped hair and careful hands, showed it to Caswell with a look that communicated something beyond the technical discovery. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had studied the apartment. Someone had known not just the schedule, but the infrastructure. This wasn't opportunistic. This was architecture. Caswell looked at J1 when Pratt showed him the window frame, and J1 held his gaze without expression. They both understood what it meant. The people who had done this were not street level. Street level people sent texts and made phone calls. People who filed down window locks weeks in advance were operating from a blueprint. Adiz asked to see the grocery receipt. Caswell hesitated, then handed her the evidence bag with the receipt visible through the plastic. She studied it for a moment, not the red crayon letters, but the receipt itself. It was from a Korean grocery store, Hanarum Market on Charles Street. She knew the store. She'd been there with J1 half a dozen times. She handed it back to Caswell and said, in a very controlled voice, "That's specific." Caswell agreed. The receipt was dated 2 days ago. The purchased items, tofu, dried seaweed, sesame oil, were mundane. But the store was in J1's neighborhood, on a street he used. Whoever had left that receipt had either been following J1 recently, or they wanted him to know they had been. It was a signature, a way of saying, "We know where you live. We know what your life looks like. We've been standing close enough to touch it for longer than you knew." In the corner of Naya's room, Caswell found something the initial sweep had missed. It was tucked behind the leg of her bookshelf, small, flat, easy to overlook, a coin. South Korean won. Old denomination, no longer in circulation. The kind of coin that existed mostly in collections now, or in the pockets of men who kept things for reasons that weren't about money. Caswell photographed it and placed it in an evidence bag. He showed it to J1 without saying anything. J1 looked at the coin for a long time, and something moved through his face. Recognition, slow and heavy. The way recognition moves when it's the thing you hoped most not to recognize. He looked up at Caswell. "I know what this is," he said. Caswell waited. J1 was quiet for a moment longer. The way a man is quiet when the past he thought he'd escaped leans forward and taps him on the shoulder. Then he said a name. One name. And the quality of the room changed. The name was Baek Hyunsu. Baek Hyunsu was the reason J1's exit had cost something beyond money. To understand Hyunsu, you had to understand what the organization looked like before J1 dismantled his corner of it. The network that J1 had operated within was not a single entity. It was a structure of relationships, debts, and territories, maintained by a code that everyone understood and almost everyone respected. J1 had held a position of considerable influence within that structure, and when he negotiated his exit, the men above him had agreed, not because they were generous, but because J1 had leverage they respected and connections they couldn't afford to antagonize. His exit was sanctioned. His territory was reassigned. And the man it was reassigned to, after a great deal of internal negotiation, was Baek Hyun-soo, a man who had been waiting for exactly that territory for 6 years, who had believed it should have been his from the beginning, and who had swallowed that belief in silence, while Jae-won held what Hyun-soo considered rightfully his. The reassignment should have settled the score. Instead, it had simply delayed it. Jae-won had known Hyun-soo since they were young men in Seoul. They had come up through adjacent circles. Not the same teacher, not the same patron, but the same general world, in the way that two rivers can run parallel for miles before one swallows the other. Hyun-soo was 3 years older, compact and quiet, with a stillness that people misread as calm, but was actually something closer to coiled. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who made threats you could hear. He communicated in objects and timing and the particular silence he maintained in a room after receiving news he disliked. He had two qualities that made him genuinely dangerous: patience and the ability to feel an insult for years without showing it. When Jae-won's exit was announced and Hyun-soo was given the territory, Hyun-soo had smiled and bowed and said the right things to the right people. Inside, he had begun counting the months, waiting for the moment when Jae-won was soft, domestic, and no longer surrounded by the infrastructure that had once made him untouchable. The old Korean won coin was Hyun-soo's signature. Everyone in the network knew it. He carried them always, a handful of the obsolete coins, heavy and dull, that had belonged to his grandfather. He left them in places the way other men left business cards. It was a way of saying, "I was here." It was also a way of saying, "I am not afraid of being known." Jae-won explained this to Caswell slowly, translating the symbolism into language that a federal agent from Baltimore could understand. Caswell listened with the expression of a man who was recalibrating several things simultaneously. "So this is a rival," he said. Jae-won corrected him gently. "Hyun-soo is not a rival. He is a man who believes he has been owed something for a long time and has now decided to collect." The distinction mattered. A rival competed. Hyun-soo didn't want to compete with Jae-won. He wanted to unmake him. Take what he loved. Make him understand what it felt like to have something that should belong to you held just out of reach. Naya was not a target in Hyun-soo's mind. She was a message. And the message was written not in crayon, but in a language Jae-won had spoken for years and hoped never to speak again. The language of leverage, of pain as currency, of making someone feel the precise shape of what they stood to lose. Jae-won sat in his car outside the apartment building after Caswell's team had finished their sweep, and he let himself understand the full architecture of what Hyun-soo had built. The months of watching, the filed window lock, the receipt from the Korean grocery store, the coin behind the bookshelf. Each element was deliberate, each one a word in a sentence that said, "I know everything about your new life. I have been inside it without you knowing. And now I have taken the most important piece of it, and what you do next will tell both of us who you still are." Jae-won understood the message completely. He also understood something that Hyun-soo had miscalculated. Hyun-soo believed that 5 months of ordinary life had made Jae-won soft. He was about to discover what 5 months of ordinary life had actually made him. By noon, Adiz had made 3 decisions that Caswell would later describe as either incredibly reckless or incredibly effective, depending on who was asking. The first decision was to go to work. Not to her nursing shift, to Mercy General's administrative records. She called in a favor from the hospital's head of community outreach, a woman named Dr. Yemi Adeyemi who had grown up in Lagos and had known Adiz since nursing school. Adiz explained only what she needed to explain. She needed to know if any Korean-affiliated business had made recent inquiries about hospital staff, patient records, or building access requests. It was not a standard request. Yemi gave her a long look through the phone and then pulled the access logs without asking why. 2 requests appeared. Both were routed through a medical supply company, a legitimate business, registered in Maryland, that had made 3 delivery inquiries to Mercy General's loading dock in the past 6 weeks, each time during Adi's shift hours. The company's registered address was a male facility in Towson. The director's name was listed as Park Yoon-jae. Adiz wrote it down, folded the paper, and put it in her scrubs pocket. The second decision was to call Chisholm. Her sister, who had cross-examined Jaewon at their first dinner and never fully stopped watching him with those prosecutor's eyes, answered on the second ring. Adiz told her what had happened in a clean, fast sequence of facts. The way she delivered a handoff report at the hospital. Time, condition, critical information, action required. Chisholm was silent through all of it. Then she said, "What do you need? Not are you okay? Not I'm coming. Not I told you this life was dangerous. Just, what do you need?" That was Chisholm. That was all of Chisholm, contained in 4 words. Adiz told her she needed someone to make phone calls in Enugu, Lagos, and Atlanta. Contacts from their father's old business network. Men who moved in gray spaces and owed their family quiet debts. Men who might know the name Baek Hyun-soo and what it connected to on the Korean side of the international trade routes that ran through West Africa. Chisholm said she would start immediately. The third decision was the one that frightened Adiz the most. She went to find a woman named Soo-yeon Park. Soo-yeon was 63 years old, Korean American, and operated a dry cleaning business on the corner of St. Paul Street that was, as Adiz had understood for years without ever directly acknowledging, something more than a dry cleaning business. Soo-yeon had known Jaewon's mother before she left. She had watched Jaewon grow up from a distance, in the way that women in those circles watch the sons of women who disappear, with a particular mixture of pity, responsibility, and pragmatic affection. She was not in the network, but she existed at its edges, the way certain people do, connected to it by history and geography and the invisible threads of what everyone knows but doesn't say. Adiz had met her twice at Jaewon's side. She had understood, without being told, that Soo-yeon was a woman who knew things. She walked into the dry cleaning shop at 1:30 in the afternoon and said, without preamble, "I need to find my daughter. Tell me what you know about Baek Hyun-soo." Soo-yeon looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned the sign on the door to closed. She poured 2 cups of barley tea, the same kind Jaewon always had, and Adiz felt the coincidence like a fist in her chest, and she sat across from Adiz and told her what she knew. Hyun-soo had property in 3 cities, a preferred location for holding leverage, a man he trusted above all others, a fixer named Choi Sang-won who did his quiet work, and a specific habit when he wanted to deliver a message with maximum impact. He kept his leverage close to water, always water, a river, a harbor, a waterfront warehouse. He liked the symbolism of it, the sense that what he held could disappear into something vast and indifferent. Adiz listened to every word. She drank the barley tea. She thanked Soo-yeon in a voice that was completely steady, which cost her more than anyone would ever know. Then she walked out into the afternoon and called Jaewon with what she had. He was silent for 3 seconds. "How did you get that?" she said. "The same way I get everything." I asked. He told himself he was going back for Naya. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Jaewon had been carrying 2 versions of himself for 5 months. The man who drove Naya to school and learned to make jollof rice, and the man who had spent a decade inside a world that operated on entirely different physics. He had worked very hard to let the second man dissolve. He had believed, most mornings, that the dissolution was working. But when Do-hyun picked him up after Adiz's call and drove without asking toward the part of Baltimore where Jaewon's old contacts still lived, Jaewon noticed something alarming and clarifying in equal measure. The old man returned without effort. No rust, no hesitation, no searching for memories that had faded. The networks, the names, the weight of how to move inside those systems. It was all still there, preserved in him like something pickled, available the moment he reached for it. He sat in the back of the car and hated that. And then he used it. The first call was to a man named Kwon Tasik in Los Angeles. Kwon was 61, Retired in the way that certain men retire, meaning he no longer held a position but still held relationships, and relationships in that world were the only currency that never devalued. Kwon had known Hyunsu longer than Jae-won had. He answered the call with the wariness of a man who had hoped never to receive it. Jae-won explained the situation without details, just the shape of it. Hyunsu had taken something that belonged to him. A child. He needed a location, and he needed it fast. Kwon was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There's a property on the Patapsco River. Registered to a shell company. Sits on the water, used for storage. Hyunsu's man Choi has been seen there." He paused. Jae-won, you understand what you're walking into? Jae-won said yes. Kwon said, then you walk in like you know you're right. Because the moment you hesitate, he'll know the exit changed you. Jae-won thanked him and ended the call. Adi's information and Kwon's information matched. The Patapsco property. Jae-won called Caswell next. He gave him the address, the shell company name, and Choi Sang-won's description. He told Caswell that federal entry would need to happen within the hour, not after, not in coordination with a longer strategy, but within the hour, and that any delay created a risk he was not willing to calculate. Caswell pushed back. Jae-won listened to the pushback respectfully and then said, simply, there's a child in there. You can coordinate around me, or you can coordinate with me. Either way, I'm going. Caswell went very quiet. Then he said, give me 45 minutes to position my team. And Jae-won, he stopped. Don't go in early. Jae-won said, I'll see you there. Which was not the same as agreeing. Caswell knew that. He started making calls the moment the line went dead. He had worked with enough men from Jae-won's world to know that 45 minutes was not a request. It was a courtesy. Jae-won made one more call before they drove to the river. He called Adi's. She answered before the first ring finished. He told her where he was going. He told her what Caswell's team was doing. He told her what he needed her to do, which was stay where she was and let him bring Naya home. There was silence on the line. Then Adiz said, she likes it when you hum. When she's scared. She told me it makes her feel like the walls are strong. Jae-won had not known this. He hadn't known that Naya experienced his humming that way. He hummed without thinking, old Korean folk songs his grandmother had sung, fragments that lived in the part of his memory that no amount of hardness had managed to reach. He sat with that for a moment. Naya, alone somewhere near the water, possibly scared, possibly pretending not to be scared the way she pretended about most things, the way she had learned from watching her mother be strong. He said, I'm going to bring her home. Adiz said, I know. And then, quietly, come back too. He drove toward the river with that in his chest like something bright. The warehouse sat at the end of a gravel road that cut through a stand of bare November trees. It was the kind of building that existed in the gap between industrial and abandoned, large enough to suggest past purpose, maintained just enough to avoid attention. The river was visible behind it, flat and gray and wide, moving with the unhurried certainty of water that has no memory and no destination. A single light burned in a high window. Two vehicles were parked on the gravel apron outside. A dark van and a silver sedan with a rental sticker on the bumper. Do-hyun cut the headlights 300 meters out and rolled to a stop in the tree line. Jae-won scanned the building from the car in the methodical way he had developed over years. Exits, sight lines, light sources, the places where a man would stand if he was watching for approach from the road. He counted 2 such places, both occupied. He could see the faint orange glow of cigarettes in the dark, which told him the men outside were cold and careless and bored, which told him they had not been briefed to expect an imminent approach. Hyunsu was confident. That was useful. Jae-won had not carried a weapon in 5 months. Do-hyun placed one on the seat between them without comment. A compact, practical thing, the kind of object that existed in Do-hyun's world the way a stethoscope existed in Adi's, as a professional instrument, morally neutral in itself. Jae-won looked at it for a moment. He thought about 5 months of school drop-offs. He thought about jollof rice. He thought about a child alone near the water. He picked it up, checked it with the muscle memory that never left, and got out of the car. Do-hyun followed. They moved through the trees in a silence that came from years of knowing how to move together. And when they reached the edge of the tree line, they stopped and waited in the dark with the patience of men who understood that timing was the most important weapon. Caswell's team had 32 minutes. Jae-won did not intend to use those 32 minutes waiting by a tree. He intended to use most of them, just not all. At 25 minutes, Jae-won moved. The two men on the outside were managed quietly and quickly. Do-hyun's particular skill, refined over 11 years, applied with the efficiency of someone who has always preferred not to make unnecessary noise. Jae-won entered through a side door that the Patapsco River wind had warped slightly off its frame, the kind of imperfection that a properly funded criminal operation would have fixed and a confident one would have left. Inside, the warehouse smelled like river damp and diesel and the specific stale cold of a space that wasn't meant for people. There were crates, a folding table with food wrappers and coffee cups, a generator humming in the corner. 3 men were visible in the main space. Choi Sang-won was recognizable from Soo-yeon's description, a lean, careful-looking man in his 40s, standing near the far wall with his phone in his hand. He looked up when Jae-won entered, and his expression did not show fear. It showed calculation, which was more dangerous. Naya was in a room off the main floor. Jae-won heard her before he saw her. She was not crying. She was singing, very quietly, to herself, a song that Jae-won recognized after a second as a Korean lullaby his grandmother had taught him, which Adiz had once played from a YouTube video at bedtime because Naya had asked about the songs from Daddy's Country. She was singing it imperfectly, with the wrong syllables in several places, in the small, determined voice of a child who has decided that fear is not going to win. Behind the closed door of that room, his 8-year-old daughter was singing herself brave with a song from his grandmother's village. The sound hit him somewhere so deep and so old that his hand tightened on the door frame and he had to breathe through it. He had 4 minutes before Caswell's team arrived. He used 2 of them handling Choi and the remaining men in the main space, in a sequence that was quiet and final. Then he opened the door. Naya looked up. She said, "Daddy," like it was obvious, like she had always known. Caswell's team arrived in the 3rd minute. They found Jae-won and Naya in the main space. Naya wrapped in his jacket, her arms around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. She was not injured. She was cold and hungry and completely composed in the way of a child who has cried everything out and arrived on the other side into a dry, clear calm. The federal team moved through the warehouse with their standard noise and procedure, and Naya watched them with her serious eyes from the safety of Jae-won's arms, and at one point she said to Caswell, "Your vest says FBI. That stands for Federal Bureau of Investigation. I know because my mom explained it to me." Caswell looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That's exactly right." Naya nodded with great satisfaction and returned her face to Jae-won's shoulder. Caswell caught Jae-won's eyes over her head and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. Choi Sang-won was in federal custody within the hour. He did not talk immediately. He was a professional, and professionals observe a silence that outlasts the first shock of arrest. But Caswell had resources and patience in a case that was already assembling itself from the evidence at the warehouse, and he communicated to Choi's lawyer, in the careful language of federal negotiations, that the window for cooperation was brief and the consequences of missing it were extensive. By the following morning, Choi had given Caswell everything. Hyunsu's operating structure in the United States, the shell companies, the names of the men above and below him, and the detail that made Caswell sit forward in his chair, the location Hyunsu himself would be in that evening. Not in Baltimore. In Philadelphia, a restaurant in the Korean district there that Hyunsu used as a base when he was moving between cities. Choi gave the address with the resigned precision of a man who understands that loyalty has a ceiling and his ceiling had been reached. Jae-won was not told about the Philadelphia location until after the fact. Caswell made that decision deliberately. He told Jae-won that Hyunsu's capture was a federal matter and that Jae-won's involvement in any direct action against him would compromise the case and potentially compromise Jae-won's own legal standing. Given the evening at the Patapsco warehouse that Caswell was currently processing with strategic slowness, Jae-won accepted this, which surprised Caswell slightly. What Caswell didn't know, and Jae-won did not explain, was that Jae-won had already communicated with Kwon Tae-sik in Los Angeles after Nia was safe, and Kwon had communicated with certain people above Hyunsu in the network structure, and those people had communicated to Hyunsu that his action had been unsanctioned, had targeted a child, and had created a federal exposure that threatened the entire American operation. In the language of that world, Hyunsu had violated the one rule that even the darkest structures maintain: you do not touch children. The organization had already made its own decision about Baek Hyunsu before Caswell's team knocked on the Philadelphia restaurant door. What federal agents found in Philadelphia was a man who had already been abandoned by everyone who had once protected him. Hyunsu was arrested without incident. No resistance, no drama, no last statement. He sat in the federal vehicle with the particular stillness of a man who has been calculating angles and realized, finally, that all of them are closed. He had spent 6 years building toward this moment of leverage over Jae-won. He had spent months executing the plan with precision. He had filed window locks and purchased groceries and left coins and moved a child with the cold patience of a man who believed in his own invincibility. And in the end, the thing that finished him was the same thing that finished all men who operated purely on calculation and pride. He had underestimated the network of a woman who asked questions and got answers. Underestimated the loyalty of an old man in Los Angeles. Underestimated the speed of a federal agent who owed a debt of silence. And most catastrophically, he had underestimated what it meant to make an enemy of a man who had already chosen peace and been pushed back into war. Jae-won was home before midnight. Nia slept between him and Adiz. Dr. Peanuts restored to his post. The week after Nia came home, Adiz did not go to work. She called in, spoke to Ren, who said nothing except, "Take whatever you need," and then she simply stayed. She cooked. She slept when Nia slept. She sat on the apartment floor and built Lego castles and watched children's movies that she had long memorized, and let the ordinary rhythmic comfort of those things do whatever they were going to do to the place inside her that was still shaking. Jae-won was home too. He had told the import company he needed personal time, and they had agreed without question in the way that people agree when they understand, even without full information, that something significant has occurred in a person's life. He cooked and cleaned and was physically present in every room that Adiz and Nia were in, not because they needed guarding. The danger was over. Caswell had confirmed it, but because proximity was all he had to offer, and he offered it completely. The three of them existed in a quiet, tender, exhausted closeness that had no name but felt like something being repaired. Nia asked one question that neither of them expected. It was on a Thursday evening, 4 days after she'd come home, while Jae-won was braiding her hair at the kitchen table. He had learned, from watching Adiz and from 2 patient YouTube tutorials, a basic 3-strand braid that Nia tolerated as long as he didn't pull too tight. Nia was quiet for a long time while he worked, and then she said, "Were those men scared of you, Daddy?" Jae-won paused. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He said, "Some of them. Probably." Nia was quiet for another moment. Then, "Is that why they took me? Because they wanted you to be scared too?" He stopped braiding. He looked at the back of her head. Her small, precise skull, her careful braids, the nape of her neck, and he felt the weight of everything she had processed alone in that cold room by the river while she sang a Korean lullaby to keep herself company. He said, "Yes, That's why. She nodded slowly. Did it work? He said. It made me move faster. Naya considered this. Good, she said. Keep braiding. Adiz watched this exchange from the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest, and something in her face that was too large and too multiple to call by any single name. She thought about the grocery receipt and the crayon and the empty bed. She thought about standing in Soo Yun's dry cleaning shop asking questions she had never expected to ask. She thought about Chisholm, who had called 3 times a day every day since and was flying in from Houston next weekend. Not because anyone had asked, but because that was what Chisholm did when the people she loved were in crisis. She showed up in person and made herself useful and didn't mention that she'd had concerns. She thought about Dara Wilson's letter in the drawer and Marcus, the taxi driver somewhere in Baltimore with $12,000 he didn't know the source of, and Caswell, who called every other day to update her on the federal case as a professional courtesy that was clearly also something more personal. All these threads, all these people, all this consequence from one bullet on one wet night outside one hospital. And here, on the other side of all of it, a kitchen table, a child's braid, a man learning to be what he'd promised. Chisholm arrived on a Saturday with 2 checked bags, a cooler of ingredients from a Houston Nigerian grocery that she declared was superior to anything available in Baltimore, and the particular energy of a woman who had been containing herself for a week and was now prepared to be fully present. She hugged Adiz for a long time in the doorway without saying anything, which was the most Chisholm thing she had ever done. Then she walked into the apartment, saw Jae-won in the kitchen, and looked at him for a long moment. Not the prosecutor's look from that first dinner. Something different, quieter, more considered. The look of a woman who has revised a verdict after new evidence. She said, "You brought her home." He said, "Yes." She nodded once, set her cooler on the counter, and said, "Move. I'm making a goosey soup and you're in my way." He moved. Naya came in from her room, saw the cooler, and screamed "Auntie Chisholm" at a volume that rattled the cups in the cabinet. That sound filled every corner of the apartment. That sound was everything. 3 months later, Jae-won sat across from Caswell in a coffee shop near the federal building, and they spoke for an hour about the case. The charges, the plea agreements, the federal investigation that was expanding in directions that had nothing to do with Jae-won anymore, and everything to do with a network whose exposure had been accelerating since Dara Wilson made her first phone call. Hyun-soo faced a federal sentence that Caswell described, in the neutral language of prosecutors, as significant and appropriate. Choi's cooperation had reduced his exposure considerably. The officer who had been on Reese's payroll was facing separate charges. Dara Wilson had been relocated and was building a new life in a city whose name Adiz didn't know and didn't need to know. When the coffee was finished and Caswell stood to leave, he paused and said to Jae-won, "Your exit. Is it still holding?" Jae-won looked at him. "Yes," he said. "It's holding." Caswell nodded. He put on his coat. He said, "Good. Keep it that way." He left without looking back. That was the last professional conversation they ever had. Some endings don't announce themselves. They just stop, and you realize later that was the end. The last thing Adiz did, on a quiet Sunday in February when the Baltimore winter had softened slightly into something almost bearable, was take Dr. Peanuts to the dry cleaning shop on St. Paul Street. The stuffed elephant had suffered in the warehouse. One of his button eyes had come loose, and his gray fabric had a new stain across the chest that no amount of spot cleaning had fully removed. She walked in and found Soo Yun behind the counter, who looked at Dr. Peanuts, and then at Adiz, and said nothing for a moment. Adiz placed the elephant on the counter and said, "Is there anything you can do?" Soo Yun took Dr. Peanuts in both hands with the care of someone handling something that matters. She examined the eye, the stain, the worn patches at the ears. She said, "Come back Tuesday." Adiz said, "Thank you. For everything." Soo Yun looked at her over the counter with the eyes of a woman who has watched a great deal of the world pass through her door. She said, "He chose well." J1. He chose very well. Adiz held that for a moment. Then she walked home through the winter light, back to her family, back to the ordinary life that kept surviving everything thrown at it. Because that was what they did. They survived. They stayed. They built. And on Tuesday, Dr. Peanuts came home with both eyes restored, the stain gone, the gray fabric clean and pressed, and smelling faintly like cedar, like something that had been through damage and come back better. Just like all of them. Asterisk if this story gripped you from the first chapter to the last. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. There are more stories just like this one waiting for you. Drop a comment and tell me, which moment broke you the most? Was it the empty bed and Dr. Peanuts sitting alone? Naya singing that Korean lullaby to keep herself brave? Or Chisholm walking into that kitchen and telling Jaewon to move because she was making egusi soup? Tell me your moment. I read every single one. And if you watched part 1 before this, tell me which part hit harder. I want to know.